Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the latest installment of the Princeton Wireless Distinguished Seminar Series. Today, I'm super excited to welcome Fadel Adib from MIT, and Fadel is, we overlapped as students, and so I'm super excited to have him here. He's done consistently over the years, just like amazing standout work on wireless sensing and X-ray vision. I remember his papers were like among the pioneering papers and the most rigorous and like cited eventually in that area. And then after that, he's gone on to do some pretty groundbreaking leadership stuff, most recently in terms of communication and networking over the oceans. But he's also very broad, and he's done a lot of stuff, including some work on COVID-19 and health monitoring and robotics, besides the stuff that I mentioned previously. So super excited to have him here today. He'll be talking about wireless and sensor technologies for oceans, health, and robotics. So with that, I'll pass it over to Fadib, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Kyle, for your kind introduction and for inviting me to give this talk. And thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm very excited to share with you the research that my group and I have been working on. I'll be telling you about how we can decode hidden worlds through wireless and sensor technologies for oceans, health, and robotics. Now, all of our research is motivated by our own human desire. As humans, we crave to explore hidden worlds, and this curiosity has driven us to pursue journeys to explore our environment, our seas, our oceans, and go even beyond this planet to explore outer space. We're also curious to explore the hidden worlds inside our own bodies to learn about our health and about our well-being. And yet we know so little. So let us take the ocean. As of this year, more than 95% of the ocean has never been observed or explored. 95%. Even our human bodies, at any point in time, I know very little about what is going on inside my body. Am I getting sick? Am I recovering? Do I have COVID? I don't know. And it's quite difficult to get this type of information right away. And even when we want to build machines that allow us to explore the world and interact with it in new ways, much of the world remains hidden from these machines. For example, when we try to build our best robots, we want them to see things just like us humans. But what if we could make robots that could see things that are invisible to the human eye? These are the types of questions that drive my group and I to think about how we can develop technologies that would allow us to explore and decode hidden worlds in our oceans, in our bodies, and through our robots. And at the heart of all of these are wireless and sensor technologies and approaches that we use to perceive, sense, communicate, and decode. So today in this talk, I'll be telling you about our research mission, which is to invent wireless and sensor technologies, and how we translate our mission to a reality in three areas that I talked about, which are the ocean, the human body, and robotics. And after we invent our technologies, I'll tell you about how we deploy them in order for us to address complex ecological and societal and industrial problems, and how we work with our collaborators in order for us to do that. For example, we collaborate with oceanographers to deploy our underwater technologies, and with medical doctors to translate our healthcare research to practice. And sometimes we ourselves spin off startups from the lab to translate our technologies to real-world impact, which is also something that I will be touching on today. So let me start by telling you about our research on the ocean. As I mentioned, more than 95% of the ocean has never been observed or explored. And what this means is that we know more about the far side of the moon and about the surface of Mars than we know about our ocean. And over the past few years, my team and I have been on a mission to take the Internet of Things to explore the underwater world. So you might be wondering why. First, there's enormous potential for, there's enormous value for getting data from the ocean for combating climate change. And underwater IoT will allow us to deploy sensors in the ocean and have that transmit data back to us so that we can measure temperature, underwater currents, monitor marine ecosystems, and use this data in climate models and in understanding the ocean's carbon cycle. Ocean sensors can also help us in discovering new species. scientists estimate that 9 out of 10 marine organisms have not been discovered yet. And underwater IoT can be deployed and it can transmit back images and sounds of animals so that we can discover new species and understand migration patterns. And underwater IoT can also play a key role in food security. 1 in every 3 people in the world rely on the ocean as their primary source of protein. And according to the United Nations, aquaculture or seafood farming will be the fastest growing food sector over the next 30 years. And it is expected to fill in the gap between supply and demand for food over the next 3 decades. So if we want to feed the world's population, we need to get aquaculture right. And an ocean IoT can help us do that, to monitor aquaculture environments in real time, optimize feeding, and intervene whenever we detect environmental hazards like harmful algae blooms. And there's many other applications for an underwater IoT, ranging from underwater robotics to mining, weather prediction, defense, disaster response, and so on. So we could enable all of these applications if we can build an underwater IoT, but we're not there yet. In fact, less than 1 in a million of the Internet of Things is underwater, even though oceans cover more than 70% of our planet. So a few years ago, we started thinking about how can we bring the Internet of Things to the underwater world? And we started thinking, oh, can we just take sensor nodes, deploy them underwater, have them collect data and transmit it back to us for long periods of time? And as we started thinking about how to do that, we faced a problem, and which was that the battery life of underwater sensors is extremely limited. Now, as we dug deeper into this problem, we realized that the main reason for this is underwater transmissions consume significant power, typically tens to hundreds of watts. And not only this, unlike a typical IoT sensor, for example, a smartwatch, which I can easily recharge every day, it's not easy to recharge a sensor if it has a battery and it's deployed in the ocean. If I want to recharge it, I need to send a research vessel, pay $30,000 to $70,000 per day just to recharge its battery and come back. So it's not feasible to do that. And this is why state-of-the-art sensors for tracking marine animals can only last for a few hours or a couple of days, after which their batteries die. And so it makes it very difficult to use existing sensors, network sensors, for long-term climate sensing or for discovering migration patterns of marine animals. And this got us thinking about, can we come up with a way to reduce the energy consumption of underwater communication so we can enable an underwater IoT that can last for long periods of time? And so I want to share with you how we've been taking steps towards overcoming this problem, and how we started doing that by developing the first technology that enables underwater backscatter networking. This kind of communication technology consumes net zero power, which means that our sensors can operate over long periods of time without requiring any batteries. So let me explain how our technology works at a high level, why we say it is net zero power. And the way I'm going to do that is by comparing it to how traditional sensors communicate underwater. Now, in underwater environments, you typically have a drone or a submarine or a ship, or maybe even an access point near the shore that wants to communicate with a large number of sensors. Now, for simplicity, let's just focus on one sensor. For those of you who are not familiar, we can't use Wi-Fi or Bluetooth underwater because radio signals, which Wi-Fi and Bluetooth use, do not work underwater. So to send information to a drone, today's sensors need to use acoustic signals. So a sensor has a speaker, and the receiving drone has a hydrophone, which is an underwater microphone. And the way the sensor transmits data is using sound waves. Now, the problem with this approach is that generating an acoustic signal requires a lot of energy, which drains the sensor's battery. In contrast, our technology does not require the sensor to generate the acoustic signal. So let me tell you how underwater backscatter works. In our design, the speaker and the hydrophone are both on the drone, and the sensor is connected to an acoustic reflector, which you can think of as a mirror. So when the transmitter sends sound, it reaches the sensor and it reflects back. So now, in order for the sensor to communicate information, all it needs to do is to take this reflector and toggle it between, for example, reflective and non-reflective states. And once it can toggle between these two states, it can transmit bits of 0 and 1, and that allows it to communicate its sensor data. Now, to summarize, in traditional communication, a sensor must generate its own acoustic signal, which is power consuming, while in our technology, it just needs to turn a switch on and off. And since the drone has its own power source, this allows us to shift all the energy requirements from the deployed sensor or network of sensors to the drone itself and make our sensor battery free. Now, this is great, but there's one question, which is, how can we control the reflections of acoustic signals underwater? Our idea to do this was to use piezoelectricity in order for us to design programmable acoustic reflectors. For those of you who are not familiar, the piezoelectric effect refers to the ability of certain materials to transform mechanical energy to electrical energy and vice versa. So let me explain this using a simplified example. Let us say that you have a piezoelectric material and we try to measure the voltage across the terminals of this material. If you have a speaker and the speaker transmits sound, which is an acoustic signal, or the sound travels as a pressure wave. And because it's a pressure wave, when it hits this piezoelectric material, it causes it to vibrate. And this vibration creates an electric signal at the terminals of the piezoelectric material. So effectively, the material transforms mechanical energy, which is sound, into an electrical energy, which is voltage. But remember that what we wanted to do is to transform this material to a reflector. And so to do that, what we did is we connected this material to a switch. When the switch is open, the material behaves exactly the same as before. It transforms an acoustic signal into an electrical signal. So let us see what happens when the switch is closed. When the switch is closed, it means that the two terminals of the material are connected to each other. And when the terminals are connected, you cannot have any voltage. And so the device cannot really vibrate. So now if you transmit an acoustic signal, where does the energy go? The energy has to be reflected back. And so by closing the switch, we're able to transform the piezoelectric material to a reflector. And to communicate now, all we need to do is to switch between the reflective and non-reflective states. And this can be done using a simple transistor. And so this allows our sensor to communicate without generating the power-consuming sound signal. Now, this is a simplified description of how the technology works. In practice, what we actually need to do is to modulate the reflection coefficient, gamma, which is given by the impedance equation that you see here. And in the interest of time, I will not go into details, but our people describe in a lot of detail how we carefully manipulate the impedance in order for us to optimize performance. And we call this technology piezoacoustic backscatter because it uses the piezoelectric effect in order to communicate by backscatter or reflection. And one of the key things is that what we've shown is that our sensor needs 1 million times less power of the order of 20 microwatts to communicate than standard underwater modems. And not only this, the sensor can also harvest energy in the non-reflective state or absorptive state, which allows it to be completely battery-free. So let me show you a video of our technology in action. So this was one of the first demonstrations that we had. This clip was shot in a large experimental pool here on MIT's campus. At the far end of the pool, you can see the hydrophone, receiver, and our projector or the speaker. And here's our sensor. It's connected to a circuit, and the circuit has an LED. Now, let me play the video and notice how the LED lights up. Remember, the sensor has no battery, so the LED lights up entirely based on the harvested acoustic energy, which is coming from the projector on the other side of the pool. So this shows that you can power the sensor remotely. Next, I want to show you how we can decode the sensor's response. So we used the hydrophone that was at the far end of the pool in order for us to measure the received signal. And let me show you what we got. So on the y-axis, I plot the amplitude. On the x-axis, I plot time. And this is the signal that we get. At about 2.5 seconds, the speaker starts transmitting. So you see a jump in the received signal. And at about 3 seconds, you start seeing the backscatter response. So you see the amplitude is switching between two different levels, which correspond to the backscatter signal. And because the hydrophone can sense these amplitude changes, it can use them to decode the backscatter packets. Now, if you're wondering why the amplitude does not go completely to zero in one of these states, for example, when it is absorbing, remember that the hydrophone doesn't only get the reflection, but it also gets the direct signal from the speaker, which is never zero. And building on this basic idea, we developed algorithms and techniques that allow us to scale to multiple nodes and deal with other reflections in the environment. So over here, you can see one of our prototypes. I'm also carrying one of them here in my hand. So we fabricate and 3D print these prototypes in-house One of the questions that I usually get is, how do you know in which direction you need to orient your reflector? And the thing to realize here is that the mirror is an analogy. Actually, these are omnidirectional, although you can also make them directional if you want, but these transducers are omnidirectional. And so independent of where the signal is coming from, you're able to reflect it. We also build these PCBs that you see here. We use them for energy harvesting, downlink and uplink communication, and integration with different types of sensors. One of the other things that I would like to note here is that this whole device costs about $100, which in the context of oceanography is pretty low cost. Oceanographic equipment costs tens of thousands of dollars today. The whole thing consumes 20 microwatts, which is, as I was mentioning, about 6 orders of magnitude lower than existing underwater modems. And over the past few years, we've been advancing this technology in different ways. So in terms of fabrication, we have been working with acoustic metamaterials to enable ultra-wideband underwater operation. We've also been developing the communication capabilities by incorporating MIMO, full duplex, multiple access. We've also demonstrated how you can use this technology to enable underwater localization. Similar to how cellular and Wi-Fi signals don't work underwater, GPS also doesn't work underwater. So we've been using these nodes to enable battery-free underwater GPS. Recently, we've been working on how can you do inference and machine learning, edge inference and machine learning on these nodes. And this has many applications in bioacoustics, which I'll be talking about in a little bit. And most recently, we've also shown how you could use these nodes to enable battery-free underwater imaging. So I don't have time to talk about all of these. I'll just choose a couple of them and tell you about what we've been doing with them. So after we showed that you can enable battery-free communication and sensing of things like temperature and pressure, we started thinking about whether you can enable battery-free underwater imaging. And so the basic idea is, can you run this whole system end-to-end underwater and capture images? So I want to show you a video of our of one of our results. Over here to the right, you can see our underwater measurement setup, which is entirely batteryless. The arrows show our imaging sensor, our multicolor active illumination, and the underwater object. And to the left, you can see the received image. Now, as I play the video, you will see the image being reconstructed. Here, I want to note 3 things. First, we use active illumination in order for us to deal with the dark underwater environments, especially for the deep sea where you don't have light. So we needed to run this whole thing with the active illumination using the harvested energy. And second, the lowest power CMOS sensors that exist today are monochromatic. So we designed multicolor LED-based illumination for reconstruction. And third, the image was reconstructed in chunks because of the limitations of the memory of the ultra-low power processors that we were using, and because of the bandwidth limitations of the underwater communication channel. So you have an end-to-end problem where there's limited memory, there's also a limited communication channel. And so how do you buffer, how do you transmit, and how do you also enable this color image reconstruction? I want to show you also a few sample images that we got. So here you could see an African starfish that we were able to image. You can see that we're able to capture its colors pretty accurately. We can also get the tubercles on its arms. This is an image that we collected in the wild of pollution. So there was, my students went to one of the lakes in the New England area, and they imaged a bottle that was put there. And this result shows that we're able to monitor growth. So you could see we planted a seed of a plant, and we could monitor how it was growing over multiple days. And this is pretty important because now we are not worried anymore about the battery limitations of underwater imaging or of underwater communication. We can monitor over an extended periods of time. And these have many of the applications, whether it's climate monitoring, whether animal monitoring, for example, for aquaculture, or whether it's pollution. Another recent project that I wanted to talk about is when we started thinking about whether we can enable battery-free underwater AI. So over the past few years, there have been a lot of advances in TinyML, ultra-low power machine learning. And we started thinking, can you bring this TinyML to do edge inference and towards even edge machine learning? And this has many applications. One of the applications that we're specifically interested in is bioacoustics. So bioacoustics is you capture the sound of animals and you try to recognize them or to recognize new types of animals. And in one of our earliest results, which was in collaboration with Imperial College, we showed that you could achieve about 85% accuracy in identifying different marine species. So this is important for being able to identify migration patterns of animals. And it's also, more fundamentally, it is a step towards to being enabling edge inference. For example, when you're deploying these sensors in the wild, have them filter the data, summarize the data, and only partially transmit information, whatever information needs to be transferred. And one of the exciting things about this is, while we've done a bunch of advances on different fronts, there's so many different open problems that we are working with and that we're collaborating on as well. So we've demonstrated that you can reduce the power consumption of underwater communication from watts to microwatts. But actually, if you were to build an IC with these, then our circuit simulations show that you should be able to drive them to nanowatt power levels. And if you do that, then you can start thinking about deploying them for many years, even decades, and stop worrying about the energy consumption altogether. We've also been collaborating with the researchers at Woods Hole oceanographic institutions to deploy these and to extend the technology towards kilometer scale communication. Some of the open problems with localization, or how do you enable underwater localization? And this opens up many opportunities in robotic exploration. And there's many other applications that I talked about before, whether it's deploying these sensors and trying to use them to discover new marine species, or in aquaculture farms, or monitoring the impact of climate change, as well as defense applications. One of the other exciting and challenging things about this project is that you have to go out in the wild and run the experiment. So one of the things that is good for us is that we have the Charles River at MIT. So we do some of our testing and deployments there. Sometimes we go out to lakes. But over here, you could see a couple of my actually undergraduate students, Osby and Jose, who are running experiments with a battery-free node in the Atlantic Ocean. And one of the other exciting applications of this technology extends even beyond our planet. NASA scientists discovered subsurface oceans in Saturn's moon Titan. So you can imagine using this technology in future space missions to look for and sample water in these planets and maybe look for life there. And actually, recently, we've also started having discussions with them on what it would take to customize these types of sensors for what is called ocean worlds, which means that the oceans that are beyond our world. And last year, this technology was highlighted as an ocean shot for the decade, which is basically a moonshot for the ocean by the US National Academy's Committee on Ocean Sciences. I also want to say that we've released all the codes and schematics and tutorials for these. One of the challenges of this project is it's very cross-layer, where there's like the mechanical fabrication, where you have to build these, how we cook them. There's the electrical part, there's the signal processing, there's the protocol, and then there's the CS part, whether it's on the imaging or the ML. And so we didn't just release the code and schematics, but also step-by-step tutorials. And we have people reach out to us from around the world on reproducing, and sometimes we even send these to researchers. So if anyone's interested, we're happy to also send over some of these samples. And with this, I've told you about the research, some of the work that we've been doing in the context of underwater backscatter for ocean IoT. I want to move to a next part of my talk, where I talk about how we decode the hidden world inside the human body. Now, over the past 2 decades, we've seen a lot of success in wearables for monitoring human health. We've been interested in 2 different angles on health monitoring. One of them is, how do you sense the human body without putting any sensor on the body from a distance using wireless reflections? And the second is, how do you sense the human body from the inside using wireless implantables? So I want to briefly tell you about what we've been doing in each of these areas, starting with contactless sensing. Now, I started working on this area when I was a PhD student many years ago. I want to just show one of the videos for one of the earliest prototypes that we built, that we had built. So this is the device that we built. I want to show a video of the device's output when we put it in another room behind the wall. In the bottom left, you see the output screen of the device. The device sends a wireless signal, which goes through the wall, reflects off the person's body, and comes back. And we use the signal in order for us to track the person's location. Now, In the bottom left, you see a red dot on the screen, which tells you where the device thinks the person is at every point in time. And the spiral on the ground is only there to show you the level of accuracy. Of course, this is me when I was a graduate student, so I've changed quite a bit since then. And the thing to note that all of this is done using the wireless reflections of the person's body. And of course, not only we could track the person's location, because you're tracking reflections, you can also track their body parts. So for example, over here, my colleague Zach is pointing at different appliances to turn them on and off. And of course, because the device works through walls, even if you leave a room and forget to turn off the light, all you need to do is to point in the direction of that room. And as I said, the device is on the other side of the wall in the room over here. So over the years, we've shown how you could enable wireless sensing to sense people's locations, gestures, breathing, and heart rate. This research led to a startup that is currently using the technology to monitor thousands of patients with Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and even COVID-19. And it's also impacted the next generation of Wi-Fi standard. It's now being discussed as core to the discussion of 5G and a number of products. And a few years ago, we were also invited to the White House where we demoed it to President Obama. As a faculty, I've been interested in how we can push the technology further and capture finer grained information. And so we've shown that you can recover heart rate, but I was interested into, like, can you get heart recordings? Can you get microcardiac events? And so to do that, what we've been working on is developing these, using some of the millimeter wave devices that have since then gotten on the market, and using them without trying to build new hardware, which we had to do at the time in order for us to capture heart reflections. And so what we've done is build these 4D cardiac beamformers that allow us to zoom in on the reflections of the human heart. And the basic idea is that you can track things in both 3D and in time through a 4D beamformer, and that allows you to focus the reflections on the human heart from a distance. And so the device sends a wireless signal, gets its reflection of the person's body, and we use these reflections in order for us to zoom in 3D space and in time in order for us to capture different microcardiac events. And so what we've shown is that you can recover even, for example, different heart valves opening and closing, like the aortic valve opening and closing, the mitral valve opening and closing, and so on. And once we were able to do that, we started thinking of how good is the signal that we were getting. So we were able to get these sort of different vibrations that we thought corresponded to the human heart. And so we were able to capture the micro vibrations, and then we tried to compare it to what is measured from an accelerometer on the human body. So let me just give a little bit of background here. There's this measurement that is called SCG, which is a seismocardiogram. Many of us are familiar with ECG, and ECG is an electrical recording of the human heart. And SCG is a mechanical recording of the human heart. And it dates back to, I think, the 70s or the 80s. What people used to do is that they used to put these very sensitive accelerometers on the apex of the heart in order to measure vibrations. And they've managed to time different microcardiac events. So they've used these on-body sensors in order to time, for example, as I was mentioning, the mitral valve opening and closing, the isovolumetric contraction, and so on. And we wanted to see whether you could use the wireless reflections in order for you to measure the same thing. So we had a person who is sitting in front of a wireless device, measuring these reflections, and we put an accelerometer on their body, and we tried to see if the signals that we were getting from wireless reflections match from the accelerometer readings. And so these are actually two real readings that we got. You can see they look quite similar to each other. The peaks and valleys almost happen in the same place. But when you try to correlate them to each other, we realized the correlation was somewhere between 0.4 and 0.6. And in fact, if you were to look
can I ask a quick question here?
Yeah, go ahead.
So this is very interesting. So what kind of signals do you send in, like an FMCW radar, and looking at the amplitude signals here, or how are we extracting the signals here? And what kind of movements are these small cardiograph movements?
Okay, so we use this chip from TI. So we are using these off-the-shelf chips. it has an antenna array already on it, already etched on the board. We do beamforming in X, we do beamforming in Y, and they also transmit FMCW. So all of this is done on the receive side. So there's 3TX, 2RX, I think. And then we zoom in on, so you can map now every point in 3D space. Then of course the question is, where is the heart? It is not the strongest reflection. It is not the fastest moving object. So we developed a 4D beamformer. So you do 3D beamforming and in time, so you can look for the frequency of the heartbeat. It's not exactly the frequency of the heartbeat because the heart rate is not perfectly constant. So there is some level of learning that I'd be happy to maybe answer questions about it towards the end of the talk. And we detail it in the paper. But the basic idea is that you zoom in then on, that's how you choose what point in 3D space you want. And that's how we extract these reflections. These reflections are after you do the projections, you look at the phase of the projected signal in order for you to track these.
And what kind of movements are these in mechanical terms? How much does the heart move as a result of these SVGs?
I mean, these are sub-millimeter movements.
Thanks.
Yeah, these are sub-millimeter movements, but we're able to track, of course, much larger movements. And even if there's multiple people in the environments, you can also separate each of them and get these for each of them. So going back, that's how we are able to extract these vibrations, and then matching them to the ECG. There was a translation, but we thought that these should probably correspond to the same thing, and there's just slightly different modalities. There's some transformation between one and the other, and so we developed. This is sort of a classical type of potentially deep learning problem where you can give pairs and get to learn the transformation from one pair to another pair. So we developed a CNN architecture that could translate these RF signals to SCG signals. And then we built on that, not just to be able to increase the correlation, but also to time 5 different microcardiac events. And we discussed the exact architectures and the parameters in our paper. So I just talked a little bit about the device that we did in terms of implementation. We evaluated it across different subjects, collected more than 100,000 heartbeats with different subjects. And in terms of results, we looked at what is our ability to time each of these microcardiac events. There's 98 to 99% accuracy in timing. And what that means is that we're able to capture it within milliseconds. Within like a couple, 2 to 3 milliseconds, something of that order. That is the level of accuracy that we're getting. Another thing that we recently also showed, so one of the things that when we started working with this project is that we required the person to remain static, and only then they could breathe, you could extract their breathing signal, but we required the person to be static and we captured the microcardiac events. And then we built on that to build a motion robust system such that it can extract the exact time, even if the person is static for like 3 seconds, which most of us are, it is able to robustly extract them. And then built on that to use in everyday environments, you capture the heart rate variability, you capture the breathing patterns, you capture different movements, and then you also use them to infer people's stress levels. And in order for us to do that, we built on a fairly mature field called effective computing, which for the past few decades has demonstrated that you could use vital signs in order for you to infer people's stress levels. And what we did is we extracted the vital signs in a contactless way, and we customized the models that people had done to do stress monitoring in order for us to show how you could enable wireless stress monitoring a person's stress without any sensor that is on their body. Now, looking forward, there's many exciting open problems still ahead. So we're collaborating with medical doctors on being able to trying to see if we can diagnose and monitor cardiovascular diseases. So the SCG has been demonstrated to be able to detect things like arrhythmia, ischemia, and so on. And the question is, can our wireless sensing modality, now that we can build a device, can you put it in someone's office near their desk, continuously monitor their cardiac events and use that to detect these diseases? How can we also, the other thing is we focus on 5 different microcardiac events, but actually people have shown that you can detect up to 11 microcardiac events. We tried to detect some of the others, they were not very robust. So the question is, how do you make this, increase the SNR of the received signal? How do you develop better algorithms so you can extract more of the microcardiac events? And the last angle that we're, as an open question, and that we're also interested in, is we've moved to stress monitoring, but how can you move to also mental health monitoring? Can you start doing interventions? Can something like this help in everyday lives? I don't know. I'm sitting in front of my desk the whole day, not taking any break. Maybe it can tell me that, look, it's time to go out of your office and take a break. Probably not everybody wants that, but it might be a good application also for these types of technologies. And so this is a short description of some of the stuff that we've been working on in contactless sensing. I also want to briefly cover what we've been working on in batteryless microimplants. Now, a few years ago at the World Mobile Conference, a man received a microimplant under his skin live at the World Mobile Conference. Some of you are familiar with these microimplants. They're like, he just got an RFID chip implanted under his skin, and he just wanted to use it to enter and leave, have access. Of course, a microimplant right under the skin is not very useful, especially if you're just using it to identify a person. In fact, in another op-ed, a Popular Science article, someone who received a microimplant wrote, my implant is both less scary and less useful than you might think. Now, a microimplant right under the skin that is just used for identification might not be very useful. But if you can take it and put it deep inside the human body, then it opens up many different applications in digital medicine. So a few years ago, my group and I set out to take a microchip like this one, which has no batteries, and put it deep inside the human body. And we wanted to communicate with it from outside the body. And even though it did not have batteries, the idea that we had is that, oh, you use wireless power, you transmit this power, it goes through the body, it powers up the microimplant, and it can send us information. And the reason we wanted to do that is that it had many applications. So for example, you can envision a network of sensors inside the body that are continuously monitoring biomarkers and tumors. For example, they could continuously monitor a person's gut and or health, and then if they get exposed to COVID, they immediately tell them it's time to self-isolate. And in the future, this information like this could be used for predicting diseases or for early intervention. Another application is in long-lasting drug delivery. Today, when you take a drug, you envision that it immediately releases the drug into the body, but there's many diseases that need long-term drug delivery. And recently, there's been talk of these smart pills that someone takes and they can release the drug over extended periods of time. But many of these have batteries, which make them larger, and the form factor becomes a problem. So if you can make it batteryless, you can eliminate the battery altogether, and then you could even have it last for a longer period of time. And there's many other applications for wireless and batteryless microimplants, including artificial pancreas for diabetes patients, deep for patients with epilepsy and Parkinson's. So that is what motivated us to start working on building these wireless microimplants in deep tissues. Now, of course, the problem is that existing microimplants work primarily at shallow depths. And so we've been working on building, developing technologies that can remotely power up microimplants and communicate with ones that are deep tissue, batteryless, and intelligent. And a unique thing about what we've been doing is that we can power and communicate with our microimplants from a distance outside the body, even when they are in deep tissues. Now, before I tell you about what we've done, it's helpful to give a little bit of background of how existing technologies for batteryless implants work. And broadly speaking, most work on wireless power falls in 2 main categories. The first is similar to what I just told you about, which is it can work from a distance, but it is just subdermal. So it can be only implanted at superficial depths. The second type is one that can operate in deep tissues, but it requires a transducer directly on the body, or requires someone to wear a vest. So for example, it uses ultrasound or it uses near field in order for it to deliver power. So what we wanted to do is to enable far field deep tissue. And the reason we wanted to do that is because that would be a much more user-friendly device. So you can imagine a device that is on a desk or near someone's bed. When they go to sleep, it charges their microimplant, it collects information, and so that they don't have to either wear something that is bulky or have it only implanted right under the skin. And the big problem was that the human body attenuates wireless signals. So if you were to transmit a wireless signal from outside the body, a lot of it reflects from the body, and then it decays exponentially inside the body, more than 1,000 times faster inside the body than in air. And the tissues also impact the harvesting efficiency. And this is why existing methods cannot power up batteryless sensors in deep tissues. And so the question becomes, how can we power up and communicate with sensors in deep tissues despite this tissue attenuation and the complexity of in-body tissues? Now, to answer this question, we've been trying to attack this problem from two perspectives. The first one is developing new beam focusing technologies that can deliver power even under blind channel conditions. So even though the sensor is batteryless, they could power it up anywhere inside the body in deep tissues and still be able to deliver sufficient power such that it can operate. And the second angle is that we've been building these self-reconfiguring microimplants that can adapt to the surrounding tissues and building intelligence into them. Now, I don't have time to go over each of these, each of the techniques, but I want to focus on one of the problems that we came across, which we thought was very interesting, and which led us to develop sort of these self-programmable microimplants. And the way we came across this problem is after we had built the original beam focusing technology, we tried to move the microimplants that we had to different parts of the body. And even if you were to move it to a different part of the body at the same depth, we were not able to power them up. And so from our perspective, you're at the same distance outside the body, you have the same supposedly power decay. Why aren't we still able to power up the implant when we put it in a different type of tissue? And the reason was that the problem is that the antenna resonance was impacted by surrounding tissues. So let me explain to you what this means. Let's say that you have a muscle tissue and you put a microimplant inside the tissue and you try to transmit a signal at 900 megahertz. And there's different research that has shown that the optimal frequency for power transfer to microimplants is in the sub-gigahertz range. So this is supposedly the optimal frequency to operate at. If you try to plot the harvested energy at that frequency, there's usually a minimum level of energy that you need to turn on. And when we transmit at 900 megahertz, you're able to power it up. So you receive sufficient energy that is above this threshold. But when you take this same microimplant, put it at the same depth but at a different tissue, for example, a fat-based tissue, then the amount of energy that you harvest is much lower. And because it is much lower, you cannot power it up. And so when we tried to investigate this, we realized the reason is because the microimplant itself is impacted by the surrounding tissues. So if you try to transmit at many different frequencies, we tried to sweep this and we tried to measure the harvested energy. The energy that we got peaked at 900 megahertz, which is why we were able to power it up at 900 megahertz inside muscle. But when we took the same microimplant and we tried it inside the fat tissue, the peak was at 1100 megahertz. So this is a problem because many times you want to build these mobile microimplants that sort of they move through different tissues. You want to still try to be able to power them up and get information from them. And the reason the shift was happening was because the surrounding resonance was impacting the tissue. So we started thinking about how can we overcome this problem and still build a microimplant that would operate across different tissues. And to overcome that, we built techniques that allow the microimplant itself to reprogram itself, including its resonance inside the body. So let me tell you how we do this. In-body microimplants typically are designed as in-body loop antennas. So you have a loop antenna, and you typically design it such that there's a harvesting chip, and it is in resonance with the harvesting chip. And the frequency of resonance is given by, it's a function of the chip, and it's a function of the loop antenna. And because of this resonance, you actually have a peak that is at, for example, 1100 megahertz inside fat tissues. And so our idea was to introduce a coupled structure in order for us to control the resonance. And so what we did is that we added another loop that couples, an outer loop that couples to the inner loop. Now, for those of us who are familiar with antenna design, we usually know that coupling is not a good idea. It's usually bad. Having two antennas that are close to each other makes them interact with each other in typically undesirable ways. And it changes the harvesting properties. So for example, instead of getting the yellow curve, we start getting this blue curve. Now, while it is true that coupling is usually undesirable, what we did is we used this phenomenon in order for us to shift the resonance frequency and build a programmable antenna. And so we added on-chip tuning through a variable capacitance. And what that allowed us to do is by controlling the variable capacitance, we were able to shift the frequency. And so using this coupled structure, we were able to do reprogramming. We were able to reprogram the resonance and enable cross-tissue energy harvesting. Not only that, you make the antenna and the whole chip end-to-end more efficient, so you also get better SNR on the uplink, and we also extended our programmability beyond harvesting to enable end-to-end rate and resonance adaptation. So here you could see one of the microimplants that we built. I also have it here in my hand. There's this microchip. We built it on a flexible substrate. It can be rolled into a pill form. It can also be, because it's flexible, it could be laminated on an organ. And we fabricated it with the different components for tuning, programmability, and so on. And this whole chip consumes sub-microwatt. It can achieve throughputs up to 6 megabits per second, and it can also adapt to surrounding tissues. And in collaboration with medical doctors, we evaluated in vitro and in vivo. We've run hundreds of experimental trials, including in live animals. So these are some of the tissues that we've tested with. And we've placed the nodes in different environments, in different orientations, in different organs. And the main result that I want to show is that if you were to, without the beamforming and without the programmability, you would have been limited to about 0.5 centimeters. But we were able to achieve depth of more than 15 centimeters and from meter scale distances outside the body. And so this allowed us to demonstrate wireless power and wireless communication with batteryless microimplant in deep tissues inside living animals. And we've been building on this technology in different ways. For example, we're now working on whether you could use it to localize microimplants as they move inside the body, using it for long-term monitoring, for drug dosing. One of the other areas is that now that you can get information from inside the body, this has a lot of security and privacy implications. So in some of our recent work, we also added sensing and we added security so that you can enable onboard encryption with the energy budget, and also so that you can enable authentication if someone is communicating on the downlink and encrypt this data on the uplink. And this concludes the second part of my talk, where I wanted to talk about sensors for the human body. The last part is much shorter. So I'll just briefly tell you about what we've been doing in robotics and automation. It is mostly a set of demos that I want to show, and I promise that I will be finishing on time if anyone is worried that this talk is 3 parts. So when we started working on robotics and automation, what we were motivated by is over the past few years, there have been amazing advances in the vision and robotics community of using computer vision to give robots the ability to see things like us humans and manipulate them. And we've been thinking about whether we can enable robots to perceive things that are otherwise invisible to the human eye. For example, can a robot know what is inside a closed box? Or is the food and medicine inside a closed bottle safe? Or can a robot fetch things that it cannot see? And the way we wanted to do this is coming from the wireless world, is that we wanted to augment robots with wireless perception. As I've shown you earlier in one of the videos, RF signals can traverse walls, they come back, and so you could use them to detect things on the other side of the walls. And so we've been using them in order for us to extend robotic perception beyond the line of sight. So let me show you a video of one of the systems that we built. Over here, there's a target item that is under clutter. The camera's line of sight is blocked. And so, for example, the camera that is in the robot's arm cannot see the item. And I want to show you a video of how you can see the robot localize the item, navigates towards it, knows where the item is, removes what is on top of it, goes back and picks it up. So how are we able to do this? The way we were able to do this is that we use RF perception, which is basically a bunch of antennas for localization. We have an RFID tagged item inside the box under the pile, and we wanted to localize it in 3D. So one of the first things that we built is we built a mechanism that can allow us to achieve ultra wideband or time of flight localization on off-the-shelf RFIDs, which gives centimeter scale 3D localization. And using that, now the robot, even though it cannot see where the item is, it has localized it using the antennas that are on the table here. And so it can start navigating towards it. So it uses vision in order for it to navigate around obstacles. And then it goes ahead, it knows the object is there, but it does not see it. So it goes ahead and it removes whatever is on top of it, and it moves it to the side because it knows that it is there. So it doesn't need to use its vision to keep looking. And then it goes back, it is this green block, it goes back and picks it up. And once it picks it up, you could see that it is able to verify that because it has an RFID that is on it. And so it is able to determine a successful grasp. And the way we do that is by formulating it as a control problem, which we detail in our ICRA paper from last year. Recently, we've been building on this to build a fully integrated robot. So moving the antennas that were on the table to the robot itself. So I want to show you one of the later videos that we've shown over here. The antenna is mounted on the robot's gripper. There is an RFID tagged key that is under the pile. And of course, the robot has a camera similar to before, but the camera cannot see the item because it is under the pile. And so, but the robot has the antenna, and so it uses it to localize the item. It moves around, it collects multiple measurements, locates them, removes whatever is on top of it, and then it is able to go ahead and pick it up and verify that it has picked up the right item. Here's another example of where we had a robotic system. This robot is now looking for a remote control that is under the clothes. We've also incorporated some of the advanced machine vision models so that it can also grasp these deformable objects. It picks up the remote control and it hands it to my student Tara so that she can watch her favorite TV show. And the way we did that is that we've built this visual reinforcement learning framework that achieved pretty high success rate across line of sight, cluttered, and fully occluded settings. In one of our upcoming works, what we've showed is that you could use this ability to localize RFIDs in order for you to make retrieving non-RFID tagged objects also much more efficient. And this is pretty interesting because we're using RF localization in order for us to localize non-RFID tagged objects and make the whole process much more efficient. This is in one of our upcoming works. And this project was also highlighted recently at MIT. And there's many applications for this technology moving forward. Some of them are in grocery fulfillment. If you imagine items are tagged with RFIDs in a grocery store, you can have robots that go in and track these items. It has many applications in warehousing and in automation. And recently we started a company, Cartesian Systems, to commercialize this research specifically in the retail automation space on RFID microlocation and RF visual fusion. So we're also looking for people to join the company on the hardware and the software side. And so this is my pitch also for anyone who is interested, graduating soon, the students who are in the crowd and looking to apply their research in wireless for problems, for industrial problems. And so with this, I've told you about our work on wireless and sensor technologies to decode hidden worlds. Of course, none of this would have been possible without my amazing students and postdocs who you see in this photo. Each of them is carrying, I mean, we love building things. So each of them is carrying something that they built, whether it's for underwater, whether it's for in air or some of the robotic stuff. And we love working together and with our collaborators in order to develop these technologies and translate them to real world impact to decode hidden worlds. Thank you very much for listening. With this, I'll wrap up my talk, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thanks, thanks, Fadel. I'll kick off the questions with just going back to the underwater work. I'm curious, can you just give us a sense of how you overcome interference and all the background noise of a real ocean, and what kind of like techniques do you have in mind to do that, to make it like, when you leave the swimming pool, you're going to get a lot of like, sea spray and waves and animals.
This is a great question. So we're operating at around 20 kilohertz. Most of the ocean noise is actually below 500 hertz. Actually, we've been running our experiments in the Charles River, which is, we recently did noise characterization, and it's 6 dB higher noise at the frequency of operation than the type of noise that you'll get in the open ocean. So it is a pretty noisy environment already that we've been operating, that more noisier than what you would have in the ocean.
Motorboats.
What is it?
Motorboats.
Because of motorboats. I mean, there's a bunch of also other experiments that are going on. There's the MIT Sailing Pavilion. So people also putting out some of their sails as well as some of the motorized boats. So interference is usually not a big problem, but you could do interference similar to how in many ways, like for example, with RFIDs, you would try to do that. You would do some form of frequency hopping. You might try to move to another frequency at the same time. Our ultra-wideband transducers allow us to operate over a much wider bandwidth than our original piezoelectric resonators that we used. In order to scale to multiple devices at the same time, we've shown both TDMA and FDMA, so you could do frequency division multiplexing, and you could still make it very efficient. So it's an interesting problem. I think actually the most interesting interference which we got is there's the self-interference because it's a backscatter. But the ISI underwater in shallow environments is so hard. The inner symbol interference is so hard. And we did not realize that, because you wouldn't imagine that if you're backscattering at 1K or at 40K, that ISI would be such a big issue. But then you realize that this is also relatively wideband with respect to the underwater channel. And so actually some of the exciting problems are, how do you build these communication protocols? How do you develop the physical layer to deal with our ISI? We've been recently working with these decision feedback equalizers, but actually going towards like, how do you enable OFDM for channel estimation? There's a lot of very interesting open problems over there to make it robust in these sort of relatively shallow water environments, but also in the open ocean.
Other questions?
I have a question that is quite relevant. It's interesting that you brought up ISI, Fadel. One of my undergraduate students also kind of establishing an underwater wireless link, and he has been saying the same thing. ISI is just surprisingly high. So I wanted to know, what are the other surprising things that you've seen, like given that you're working in this difficult environment, like both in body and ocean. I don't know if there is a channel model, for example, for in-body wireless communication. Any lesson learned from modulations to use, not to use, those sort of things?
Underwater, the underwater communication channel, it has been studied. I mean, there's been quite a bit of research in this space. Of course, it has not been studied in the context of backscatter before. The coherence time, like this channel is changing pretty fast. Like the coherence time, the Doppler that you get, like if you get the Doppler from something that is moving, and it becomes big because your center frequency is like relatively low. So you end up having these super long OFDM sort of symbols in order for you to operate underwater. So doing decoding robustly, we've been working with RFIDs for a very long time. We had to build much more robust decoders than what we could do with RFIDs, like a bit by bit decoder, which is, I mean, we also release, that's also why we release a lot of these sort of the code that we've been using there. So I'd say from a communications perspective, these have been pretty interesting. I mean, we wouldn't have expected to run through all of these problems. Then there's all of the logistical problems. How do you waterproof these? How do you make sure that you're putting these electronics underwater and they're still working? It gets very cold outside. Sometimes the electronics stop working just because it gets cold. So how do you harden them in a certain way? There's these other sort of, they sound like menial problems, but they actually, we need to take care of them in the project. The in-body is, I think, the same to some extent, in the sense that once you start going to higher throughputs inside the body, then it also becomes frequency selective. And the traditional ways that we would do backscatter decoding starts becoming also much harder.
I'll just jump on that. Sorry, I'll just jump on that with a question from the audience, since it's relevant to what we were talking about just now. So the audience is asking, in the heart rate activity monitoring work, how controlled does the measurement need to be? For example, how do you need to position the transceiver relative to the human?
Yeah, so in our latest work, it is not controlled at all, in the sense that we deployed it for like a day. I come into my office, it can detect when I am, and then it can do the beamforming. If it gets a good signal, it knows that it's getting a good signal. If it doesn't get a good signal, it knows that it needs to discard it. This is what I talked about in terms of motion robustness in the stress monitoring project. The original project was actually pretty sensitive, in the sense that the person needed to stay static and sitting in a specific way. And so that's what really led us in the follow-up to make it motion robust. And with many of these, originally we thought that, oh, this is a problem that could be overcome in the future, and we were right. But it turns out that developing the algorithm that can like extract a good chunk of time where you're not asking a person to remain sick, ends up being a non-trivial, a pretty hard problem. And in fact, it's also a problem with wearables, and people have looked into motion contamination with wearables as well. With RF, you need to do it in a different way, and the types of motion contamination that you get is different. But in the most recent stuff, it can actually automatically detect. We put it when people were sleeping. Of course, it learns when it needs to discard or keep measurements. But it is pretty robust. I think there are open questions in the sense that how can you extract more, how can you discard less data? How can you make it such that you're able to get more time segments and you could do better inference? Whether or not that is required probably depends on the application.
I'll just invite people, if they feel comfortable, they can unmute, or they can put some questions in the chat for Fadel. Any other questions?
I have a quick question. So for in-body communication, there is a sort of huge line of work on thermal energy harvesting. Have you looked into this, and how do you compare that line of work with yours?
Yeah, there's thermal, and there's also piezoelectric energy harvesting, like using flexible PZT electronics. So one of the main, I think thermal has less energy. In-body piezo has more energy. The problem with it is that it is anatomically specific. And what anatomically specific means is, for example, it can harvest in areas that there is a lot of motion, but in areas that there isn't a lot of motion, you cannot harvest energy anymore. And so it depends on the type of use case. Either way, I think you can harvest more from RF if you were to design it well than you would be able to from thermal. There's also these glucose, which I think are fascinating, like these fuel cells that want to use the body's like biology and the chemistry in order for them. But those, again, I think the amount that you can harvest from them, it's either anatomically specific or the amount that you can harvest from them is less.
Interesting. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. We're well over time. So if there's a quick question, we'll take it. Otherwise, we're going to wrap. And I don't see any questions. So with that, I just want to say, close by just thanking Fadel so much for his really interesting talk. And we'll end there and see everyone at the next Princeton Wireless Distinguished Seminar series. So goodbye for now.
Thank you, Fadel.